In the earliest days, when the land that would one day be called America untouched by the modern world, life was bound entirely to the rhythm of the earth. The forests stretched endlessly, their canopies so thick that only shafts of sunlight pierced through, touching the ground in trembling golden beams. Rivers roared with life, filled with salmon leaping against the currents, and deer moved cautiously in herds through the tall grasslands. The people of this land lived not above nature, but as part of it, tied to the seasons, to the stars, and to the whispers of the wind. A small village rested beside one of these rivers, its homes built from timber, bark, and hide stretched tightly over wooden frames. Smoke drifted from the tops of these dwellings, carrying the scent of roasted game and charred wood into the sky. Each morning began not with the sound of clocks, for there were none, but with the calls of birds and the soft crackle of the fire being stirred back to life. Children would wake first, their laughter echoing between the huts. Before the grown men and women rose to greet the day, food was never taken for granted. Before a hunt began, there was ritual and offering to the spirits of the forest. Men painted their faces with charcoal and clay, whispering words of thanks for the life they were about to take. Women prepared dried berries, nuts, and herbs, storing them carefully in woven baskets for the journey. Nothing was wasted. Bones were carved into tools, sinews became thread, hides were tanned into clothing. Even the smallest fish or rabbit was honored, for it meant survival through the biting cold of winter nights. Life was not easy, yet it was deeply connected. Children learned from elders by watching, listening, and repeating. They learned how to shape arrowheads from flint, how to set traps in the underbrush, how to read the tracks of animals pressed faintly into the soil. They were taught to listen not just to voices, but to silence. A broken twig could mean prey nearby, or it could mean danger. The forest spoke, and those who survived were the ones who heard its language. At night, the village came alive with stories. Firelight flickered on the faces of elders as they recounted tales of creation, of the great spirits who painted the sky with stars, of ancestors who once walked with the animals as brothers. The crackle of the flames mixed with the rhythm of drums, hands striking stretched skin in steady beats that echoed into the forest. Children leaned close, their eyes wide, as shadows danced along the earthen walls, making the spirits seem alive in the glow. The people did not see themselves as masters of the land, but as its children. They moved with the herds and rivers, never taking more than they needed. The women tended to crops of maize, beans, and squash, watching carefully for the shifts in the weather that could ruin a season's labor. Men hunted not for glory, but for necessity, their bows strung with sinew, arrows tipped with obsidian or flint, guided by patience more than strength. And together, they endured the storms, the harsh winters, the sudden sicknesses that sometimes swept through the community. But within this endurance, there was joy. In the laughter of a child splashing in the river, in the warmth of family gathered close under firs as snow howled outside, in the songs sung to the sky, voices rising together in harmony that carried farther than any one man could walk. These were not people chasing wealth or conquest. They were people who lived each day with reverence, grateful for the sun when it rose, grateful for the rain when it fell, and grateful for the earth that gave them life. To live in that time was to feel both fragile and eternal. Every day was a test of strength, but every day was also a celebration of survival. The bond between human and land was unbroken, and it was in that bond that their world thrived, untouched, pure, and alive with the pulse of something far greater than themselves. The first light of dawn crept across the vast wilderness, stretching shadows over forests, rivers, and endless plains. In these early centuries, long before machines or iron rails carved scars into the land, people lived as one with the rhythms of the earth. Their lives were bound not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing winds, and the shifting seasons. Every sound in the forest carried meaning: the cry of a hawk overhead, the rustle of deer moving through tall grasses, the distant rush of a river swollen with rain. Life was harsh, but it was real, and it was deeply tied to the land. Along the banks of a wide river, a village stirred to life. The homes were simple structures, made from bent saplings covered in hides and bark. Smoke curled from the openings at the top, carrying with it the scent of last night's fire. Children woke first, their voices rising in laughter, playing with sticks and stones that served as their toys. Their mothers, wrapped in furs against the lingering chill of morning, tended to the fires, coaxing sparks into flame with practiced patience. Men prepared for the day's hunt, checking their bows and sharpening stone arrowheads. Each movement had purpose. Each task was a thread in the fabric of survival. Before leaving the village, the hunters paused. They gathered at the edge of the forest, painting their faces with ash and ochre, murmuring prayers to the spirits of the land. They believed that every creature carried a soul, and to take life required respect and balance. Offerings of tobacco, berries, or carved trinkets were left upon stones, asking forgiveness for what they must do. Only then did they move into the shadows of the forest, where silence became their companion, and patience was as vital as breath. The women's work was no less important. They cared for the crops, rows of maize, beans, and squash growing in the fertile soil near the river. They bent low, their hands covered in earth, tending carefully to each plant. These crops were known as the Three Sisters, and together they sustained the people through seasons of scarcity. When storms threatened, women prayed to the skies, singing low songs that carried across the fields, songs their mothers and grandmothers had sung before them. Children watched and learned, their small hands copying the gestures of their elders. For knowledge was never written, it was lived, remembered, and passed on in every action. By midday, the village pulsed with activity. The sound of scraping hides, of grinding stones against maize kernels, of laughter rising from children at play filled the air. Dogs barked and chased one another between the huts, while elders sat in circles, telling stories that reminded everyone who they were and where they had come from. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the lifeblood of memory, the way history survived without ink or paper. When the hunters returned, the village gathered to greet them. They carried deer slung across their shoulders, rabbits in woven nets, fish caught in the river's strong currents. There was no waste. Meat was prepared carefully, hides stretched and dried for clothing or shelter, bones shaped into tools, sinews twisted into thread. Every part of the animal found use, and every life taken was honored with ritual words and gestures. The children learned by watching, for survival depended not only on strength, but on remembering the lessons of those who came before Dot as the sun sank low, painting the sky in hues of red and gold. The village gathered around the central fire. Flames licked upward, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the people. Elders began their stories, voices steady and rhythmic, recounting how the world was made, how the staid first light of dawn crept across the vast wilderness, stretching shadows over forests, rivers, and endless plains. In these early centuries, long before machines or iron rails carved scars into the land, people lived as one with the rhythms of the earth. Their lives were bound not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing winds, and the shifting seasons. Every sound in the forest carried meaning: the cry of a hawk overhead, the rustle of deer moving through tall grasses, the distant rush of a river swollen with rain. Life was harsh, but it was real, and it was deeply tied to the land. Along the banks of a wide river, a village stirred to life. The homes were simple structures, made from bent saplings covered in hides and bark. Smoke curled from the openings at the top, carrying with it the scent of last night's fire. Children woke first, their voices rising in laughter, playing with sticks and stones that served as their toys. Their mothers, wrapped in furs against the lingering chill of morning, tended to the fires, coaxing sparks into flame with practiced patience. Men prepared for the day's hunt, checking their bows and sharpening stone arrowheads. Each movement had purpose. Each task was a thread in the fabric of survival. Before leaving the village, the hunters paused. They gathered at the edge of the forest, painting their faces with ash and ochre, murmuring prayers to the spirits of the land. They believed that every creature carried a soul, and to take life required respect and balance. Offerings of tobacco, berries, or carved trinkets were left upon stones, asking forgiveness for what they must do. Only then did they move into the shadows of the forest, where silence became their companion, and patience was as vital as breath. The women's work was no less important. They cared for the crops, rows of maize, beans, and squash growing in the fertile soil near the river. They bent low, their hands covered in earth, tending carefully to each plant. These crops were known as the Three Sisters, and together they sustained the people through seasons of scarcity. When storms threatened, women prayed to the skies, singing low songs that carried across the fields, songs their mothers and grandmothers had sung before them. Children watched and learned, their small hands copying the gestures of their elders. For knowledge was never written, it was lived, remembered, and passed on in every action. By midday, the village pulsed with activity. The sound of scraping hides, of grinding stones against maize kernels, of laughter rising from children at play filled the air. Dogs barked and chased one another between the huts, while elders sat in circles, telling stories that reminded everyone who they were and where they had come from. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the lifeblood of memory, the way history survived without ink or paper. When the hunters returned, the village gathered to greet them. They carried deer slung across their shoulders, rabbits in woven nets, fish caught in the river's strong currents. There was no waste. Meat was prepared carefully, hides stretched and dried for clothing or shelter, bones shaped into tools, sinews twisted into thread. Every part of the animal found use, and every life taken was honored with ritual words and gestures. The children learned by watching, for survival depended not only on strength, but on remembering the lessons of those who came before Dot. As the sun sank low, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, the village gathered around the central fire. Flames licked upward, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the people. Elders began their stories, voices steady and rhythmic, recounting how the world was made, how the stars came to rest in the heavens, how ancestors had walked alongside the animals in a time when the earth was young. Drums joined in, their beats steady, echoing through the night and carrying far into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The children leaned close, eyes wide with wonder, their imaginations painting pictures of spirits and heroes in the smoke above the flames. Men listened, sharpening tools by firelight, while women worked with their hands, weaving baskets or sewing garments, all while humming low melodies that blended with the rhythm of the drums. Life was not easy, yet within these moments of shared warmth and story, there was joy, connection, and purpose. Winter brought its own trials. Snow fell heavy upon the land, blanketing forests and plains alike. The river froze at its edges, and food became scarce. The people drew close within their shelters, furs piled high, fires kept alive through long, cold nights. It was then that the strength of the community shone brightest. They shared what they had, ensuring no one starved, ensuring that even the weakest were cared for. Children learned the harshness of hunger, but they also learned compassion. As bowls of stew were passed from hand to hand, with none forgotten, the hunters risked their lives in the cold, tracking deer across frozen ground, moving silently through snow that cracked beneath their feet. The women wove thicker clothing from hides and furs, their hands chapped but steady. Elders continued to tell their stories, voices hoarse but determined, for they believed that as long as the stories lived, the people could endure any hardship. And so, through seasons of plenty and of want, through storms and clear skies, through the birth of children and the passing of the old, life endured. Every dawn was both a challenge and a blessing. Every night was both a time of rest and of remembrance. These people lived not for wealth or conquest, but for survival, for harmony, and for the bonds that tied them to one another and to the world that cradled them. To live in those ancient days was to feel the rawness of existence. Every breath, every heartbeat, every step taken across soil or stone mattered. The earth was not background, it was family. The wind, the fire, the river, the stars, all were alive, all were part of the same great circle. And in that circle, fragile as they were, the people found strength, hope, and meaning. The nights in the ancient world were vast and endless, blanketed by stars that seemed closer than they do today. Without the haze of city lights, the heavens opened fully, each constellation like a story written across the sky. Families would lie back near the fires, wrapped in furs, children pointing at shapes above, listening to the elders describe the bear who chased the hunter, or the coyote who tricked the moon. The universe was alive to them, every star pulsing with meaning, every comet a sign. During warmer seasons, life stretched beyond the village. Families moved with the herds, traveling across plains where grass swayed like waves under the wind. They carried belongings on wooden frames, pulled by dogs or sometimes by people themselves, leaving behind only footprints and memories. Each journey brought new challenges, crossing swollen rivers, enduring sudden storms, or facing rival groups that also sought survival. Yet, these movements tied them closer to the land, teaching them roots, rivers, sacred hills, and hidden valleys where food and safety could be found. In springtime, the renewal of life was celebrated. Festivals took place where drums beat faster, dances carried people in circles, and laughter echoed across open fields. Men and women painted their faces in bright colors of red, yellow, and black, symbolizing the earth, the sun, and the cycles of life. Songs rose high, not for performance, but as offerings, voices lifting to the spirits of rain and growth, asking for fertile fields and bountiful hunts. Children joined, clapping, stomping, learning that joy was as vital as work in the balance of life. Every task had rhythm. Grinding maize between stones was accompanied by the steady hum of women's voices. Carving wood into bows or spears was done with focus and care, each motion perfected through years of practice. Fishing was not just casting a net, but knowing the waters, the depth, the flow, the hidden places where fish gathered. The people did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as woven into its great pattern. To break that pattern meant disaster. To live within it meant survival. Hardship, however, was constant. Illness swept through villages unexpectedly, claiming the old and sometimes the young. Without herbs and remedies passed down through generations, survival would have been impossible. Women skilled in healing gathered plants from meadows and forests, roots that eased fevers, leaves that stopped bleeding, barks that soothed pain. These healers were respected, for in their knowledge lay the power to pull someone back from the edge of death. Around them, families prayed, offering gifts of food or carved tokens, whispering pleas to the unseen forces of life. There were times of scarcity, when the earth gave little, droughts dried the rivers, and game moved far beyond reach. Bellies ached, and patience grew thin. Yet, even then, sharing remained sacred. No one hoarded openly, for selfishness endangered the whole. A child might be given food before a grown hunter, because the future of the people rested in the young. Hunger taught humility, but it also taught unity. Every hand was needed, every effort mattered, every gift of the earth was treated as a blessing. The passing of seasons marked the passing of lives. Birth was celebrated with songs and blessings, mothers surrounded by the warmth of family, newborns wrapped in soft hides, their first cries welcomed as signs of renewal. Death, too, was honored not with fear, but with reverence. The body was laid carefully to rest, covered in gifts for the journey beyond, beads, feathers, or tools to guide them in the next world. Songs rose not in mourning alone, but in gratitude, remembering the stories and lessons the departed had left behind. In this way, life in those ancient days was a constant circle. Work and rest, hunger and feast, birth and death, struggle and joy, all were part of the same endless rhythm. To live was to walk upon the earth with awareness, to see meaning in every stone, every river, every star above. And though centuries have passed, though steel and glass have replaced wood and stone, the echo of that life still lingers. It is carried in the stories, in the songs, in the memory of a people who lived not apart from the land, but within it, body and spirit bound to the great and eternal earth. The rhythm of life in the ancient days was never rushed, yet it was never still. Each morning began with the slow crackle of rekindled fires, the hiss of damp logs catching flame, and the smell of smoke drifting through cool air. Before the sun fully rose, the village was already alive with movement. Children chased each other between huts, their laughter echoing in the stillness. Wild dogs padded along at their heels, tails wagging. Mothers' voices called out softly, guiding them back toward tasks fetching water from the river, gathering kindling, or grinding maize on flat stones. The hunters prepared in silence. They spoke little before a hunt, for words could weigh heavy on the spirit. Instead, they moved with ritual precision, painting lines of ash or ochre across their faces, symbols passed down through generations. These were not decorations, but prayers, marks of respect to the spirits of the forest and the animals they would pursue. A bow was tested with care, sinew stretched and adjusted. Arrows were checked one by one, their obsidian tips sharp enough to pierce hide and bone. A single broken arrow could mean hunger for a family, so nothing was left to chance. As they left the village, the women called after them with blessings. Some carried infants on their hips while waving, others simply watched, worry hidden behind steady eyes. The men disappeared into the trees, their footsteps fading until only the sound of wind through branches remained. Life within the village was no less demanding. Women and older children worked the fields, bending low over rows of maize, beans, and squash. Their hands moved confidently through soil, pulling weeds, firming roots, and adjusting mounds of earth that held the crops steady against wind and rain. These crops were not just food, they were life itself. Gifts from ancestors who had learned through centuries of trial how to coax growth from the land. Without them, winter would bring nothing but hunger. The younger children carried water in clay pots from the river, stumbling sometimes under the weight, but proud to help. Elders, too frail to hunt or farm, remained near the fires, their role no less vital. They taught, they reminded, they passed along memories that reached further than any single life could. Their stories told of great migrations, of times when their people followed the herds across endless plains, of the mountains where spirits dwelt, of floods and droughts endured long before. Every story was a thread woven into the great fabric of identity, ensuring that the people never forgot who they were. When the hunters returned, their success or failure shaped the mood of the evening. Some days they came back with deer slung across their shoulders, the animal honored with quiet words before being prepared. Other days, only rabbits or fish filled their nets, smaller, but no less important. And sometimes they returned empty-handed, their faces drawn with fatigue. On such nights, the fire burned lower, meals grew thinner, but the community bore it together. Hunger was never a private burden. It was shared. Preparation of food was itself a ritual of care. Meat was roasted slowly, its scent filling the air and drawing the children close. Women dried strips of flesh for storage, knowing winter demanded foresight. Skins were stretched and cleaned, later to become clothing or coverings. Bones were split and carved into needles, fish hooks, or tools. Even sinews were twisted into strong cords, vital for sewing or binding. Nothing was wasted, for waste was a betrayal of the life that had been given. At dusk, as shadows lengthened, the village gathered around the great fire. Flames rose high, sparks carried into the night sky where stars had begun to shimmer. The fire was not just warmth, it was the heart of the people. Round it, Songs were sung, voices rising and falling like the waves of a river. Drums carried the beat of the earth itself, steady, grounding, eternal. Children danced in circles, imitating the steps of their elders while laughter mingled with music. The elders began their stories. Some told of creation, when the world was nothing but darkness and silence until a great spirit shaped land from water, sky from emptiness, and stars from embers of fire. Others spoke of ancestors who learned to live with animals as brothers, who listened to the wisdom of wolves, the patience of turtles, the sharp eyes of eagles. These stories were not fantasy to the people, they were truth, carried from one generation to the next, a way of remembering the lessons hidden in the fabric of existence. Seasons shifted, bringing new challenges. In summer, storms rolled across the plains, lightning flashing like fire across the sky. Rain pounded the earth, swelling rivers, flooding fields, testing the strength of every shelter. Yet when the skies cleared, the earth was renewed, crops greener, rivers fuller, fish more plentiful. Autumn was a season of gathering, when harvest filled baskets and families worked side by side to store enough food for the cold months ahead. Winter was the true test. The world grew silent, blanketed in snow that muffled sound and swallowed paths. The river froze at its edges, its current hidden beneath a skin of ice. The hunts grew longer, more dangerous, as game animals retreated deep into the forest. Fire became sacred in those months, guarded carefully, tended constantly. Families huddled together in shelters, furs piled high, sharing warmth as winds howled outside. In those long nights, when hunger gnawed and frost crept close, the stories mattered most. Elders' voices carried through the dark, reminding the people that they were part of something greater, that hardship was not forever, that the cycle would turn and spring would come again. Children listened, eyes wide in the firelight, clinging to every word. Songs rose, low and steady, a comfort that reached deeper than food or fire could. And when at last spring arrived, when snow melted into rivers that rushed and foamed, when the first shoots of green pushed through thawing soil, the people celebrated with joy so fierce it shook the air. Drums thundered, feet stamped the ground, voices rose in chants of gratitude. For every winter survived was not just endurance, it was triumph. Through all this, life remained fragile, yet full. Every day demanded effort, but every day carried beauty as well. The flash of sunlight on a river, the cry of an eagle circling overhead, the laughter of children playing in the dirt. The people lived not as rulers of their world, but as its children, woven into its patterns, dependent on its gifts, respectful of its dangers. They knew joy not in possessions, but in connection, in the bond between families, in the trust between hunter and land, in the stories that bound generations together. And though centuries have passed, the echo of their lives remains, carried like whispers in the wind, in the flowing rivers, in the stars that still shine as they once did over endless nights. Part 2. Morning after morning, the cycle of life continued. Each day began with the same simple motions, yet no day was ever truly the same. The songs of birds changed with the seasons, the taste of air shifted with the winds, and the earth itself seemed to breathe differently depending on the time of year. To the ancient people, these changes were not background, they were messages. They watched, listened, and interpreted, for their survival depended on it. A sudden silence in the forest could mean a predator nearby, a ring of frost on the ground, even after the sun had risen, warned of a harsher winter to come. The flight of geese across the sky was not simply a beautiful sight, it was a reminder that the world moved in cycles, and they must prepare to move as well. The young were trained to see these signs from the earliest age. A child walking beside his father would be taught to notice the broken twig, the faint print of a hoof in the mud, the curve of grass that bent in one direction rather than another. A girl learning from her mother would be shown which roots carried medicine, which berries could kill, which bark could be boiled to heal a fever. Knowledge was not written, it was lived, passed hand to hand, word to ear, moment to moment. Every gesture, every story, every shared silence was part of their education. When a hunt succeeded, the village thrived. Fires crackled, the smell of roasting meat carried far, and children pressed close to watch as elders explained how to prepare the animal. When a hunt failed, hunger tightened its grip. Yet the people did not despair easily. They believed that hardship was a test, that the land sometimes withheld its gifts to remind them of humility and patience. In those times, small victories mattered: the catching of a single rabbit, the finding of wild berries along a trail, the discovery of fish trapped in a shallow stream. The community was built not on wealth or power, but on sharing. A hunter who returned with more than his family needed gave freely to others, for he knew that tomorrow he might return with nothing. A woman who gathered more herbs than she could use shared them with healers, who in turn gave their knowledge to all. The survival of one depended on the survival of all. And selfishness was a shadow quickly noticed and gently corrected. Ceremonies marked the passing of seasons. In the spring, when the first buds broke through frozen soil, people sang songs of gratitude to the earth. In summer, when crops grew tall and rivers swelled, they danced in circles, faces painted with symbols of sun and rain. Autumn brought celebrations of harvest, feasts where laughter and stories flowed as freely as food. Winter carried solemn rituals, prayers whispered to ancestors by firelight, asking for strength to endure the long cold. Every sound, every movement carried purpose. The crack of a drum was more than music. It was heartbeat, grounding the people in unity. The dance was not for entertainment, but for connection, a way to bind body and spirit to the rhythms of the earth. Songs carried memories, telling of battles with hunger, of floods survived, of stars that guided travelers across vast distances. Children absorbed these traditions with wide eyes, clapping hands, and hesitant voices that grew stronger with each season. The elders often reminded them, life was a circle. What was taken must be returned. To take from the earth without gratitude was to invite misfortune. To break the harmony of the community was to weaken the circle itself. And so they lived carefully, balancing need with respect, hardship with celebration, silence with song. But danger always lingered. Wild animals prowled at the edges of the village. Wolves hunted deer, but sometimes hunger drove them toward human fires. Bears wandered close in search of food, their power unmatched, their presence a reminder that man was not the only master of the land. Storms, too, could destroy in moments what took months to build, winds tearing through shelters, floods washing away crops, lightning setting forests ablaze. Each threat tested the resilience of the people, yet each also taught them to endure, to rebuild, to adapt. When sickness came, it struck without mercy. Children coughed with fevers, elders grew weak, and sometimes whole families fell to unseen forces of nature. In those times, healers worked tirelessly, gathering herbs, boiling roots, whispering prayers as they laid hands on the sick. The people sat together in silence, listening to the crackle of fire, waiting for signs of recovery. Death, when it came, was met with tears, but also with reverence. The dead were not lost, they had simply walked ahead into another part of the circle. Their names were spoken in stories, their lives remembered in detail. Their presence felt around the fire even after their voices had gone silent. Children born into the village were welcomed with celebration. Songs filled the air, women painted their faces with bright colors, and fathers lifted their newborns toward the sky, introducing them to the sun, the moon, and the earth. The newborn was wrapped in soft hides, cradled by many arms, carried from hut to hut so every person could whisper blessings. Life was fragile, yet every birth was proof that the circle continued. Through the years, the people grew strong not by dominating the world, but by living within it. They learned that patience was as vital as courage, that generosity was as necessary as skill. They lived in a world where every sunrise was uncertain, yet every sunrise was also a gift. And as night fell, stars blanketing the sky once more, the fire burned in the center of the village, its flames carrying sparks upward as if joining the constellations. Around it, voices rose, some laughing, some singing, some whispering tales of the past. The circle of people mirrored the circle of stars, both eternal, both endless, both bound by the same rhythm of life. As the years unfolded, life in the ancient world flowed in cycles as steady as the rivers that carved valleys through stone. Each season left its mark upon the people, shaping them as surely as wind shapes cliffs. In the height of summer, when the air shimmered with heat and insects buzzed in endless swarms, the people sought shade beneath great trees, their broad leaves sheltering families from the burning sun. Children splashed in the river, their laughter ringing like bells, while older boys practiced swimming against the current, learning to respect the power of water. Girls wove reeds into mats and baskets, their nimble fingers quick, turning simple plants into tools of survival. In the evenings, when the heat cooled, the village came alive with dances. Men painted their arms and chests with clay, stamping their feet to the rhythm of drums, their bodies echoing the heartbeat of the land. Women sang, their voices high and clear, carrying into the night like the call of birds. Autumn was a time of labor and reward. The fields offered their gifts, maize harvested in golden rows, beans pulled from thick vines, squash lifted heavy from the soil. Families worked together, hands blistered, but spirits light, as baskets filled and stores grew full. The harvest was more than survival. It was celebration. Fires blazed higher, feasts stretched long into the night, and gratitude flowed in every word, every song. For each ear of corn held the memory of planting, of tending, of praying through storms, and of enduring drought. To eat was to remember, and to remember was to honor. Winter was the crucible. When snow buried the fields and ice sealed the rivers, the people turned inward. The cold cut deep, freezing breath into clouds, stiffening limbs, numbing fingers. Yet within their shelters, warmth persisted. Fires glowed steadily, their crackle constant. their smoke rising through small openings into the endless gray above. Families huddled close, wrapped in furs, telling stories that stretched long into the dark nights. Elders' voices wove tales of spirits who guided the seasons, of animals who had once spoken, of ancestors whose courage shaped the world they now inherited. Children listened, wide-eyed, their imaginations painting images in the smoke and shadows. In those nights, silence outside pressed heavily, broken only by the howls of wolves or the groan of trees shifting under snow. Inside, the drumbeat of hearts, the steady rhythm of voices, the warmth of human presence became shields against the vast cold. To endure winter was not simply to survive, it was to prove the strength of unity, of sharing, of belief. Spring brought renewal. Snow melted into rivers that roared with new life, carrying branches and stones in their current. The first shoots of green broke through thawing earth, fragile yet determined. Birds returned, filling the air with their songs, while deer and elk moved once more through the valleys. The people celebrated with dances of gratitude, their songs rising to greet the rebirth of the land. Children ran barefoot on soft ground, their laughter mingling with the calls of birds, their joy a promise of the circle's continuation. Life was fragile, always balanced on the edge of uncertainty, yet it was filled with beauty. The people knew the taste of hunger, the sting of cold, the weight of loss, but they also knew the warmth of family, the joy of song, the wonder of stars. They lived close to the earth, close to each other, their days shaped not by ambition for more, but by reverence for enough. The elders often said, "The earth is our mother, the sky is our father, and the fire is our heart," and the people believed it. Each tree was not just wood, but shelter. Each river was not just water, but life. Each animal was not just meat, but a fellow traveler on the path of survival. To forget this was to fall out of harmony, and harmony was the key to endurance. So the circle turned, year after year, generation after generation. Children grew into hunters, into farmers, into storytellers. Elders passed into memory, their wisdom carried on in songs and tales. Births brought celebration, deaths brought reverence, and the rhythm of life continued unbroken. In that ancient world, where stars blazed brighter and silence stretched deeper, people lived with a truth that modern times often forget, that to be alive was to be connected to the land, to the sky, to the spirits, and to one another. Their lives were hard, yes, but they were also full. Every sunrise was a gift, every meal was a blessing, every story was a thread in the endless fabric of existence. And those centuries have passed. Though stone has given way to steel, and rivers now carry boats instead of fishers, the echoes of those lives remain. In the wind that whistles through forests, in the cry of hawks overhead, in the constellations that still shine as they did over countless fires long ago, the memory endures. They lived, they endured, and in their endurance, they left behind not monuments of stone, but lessons written in earth and sky, lessons that whisper still, live with balance, live with gratitude, live within the circle. The dawn came slowly, painting the horizon with pale streaks of gold. Mist clung to the lowlands, curling between the trees and over the river like a living spirit. The village stirred awake, one fire rekindled after another, smoke rising in slender threads toward the brightening sky. The air smelled of damp earth, of ash, of the faint sweetness of spring blossoms drifting on the breeze. Men rose first, stretching stiff limbs, pulling on hides that still carried the scent of last night's smoke. They left their shelters with spears and stone blades strapped to their sides, heading into the forest to hunt. Their footfalls were careful, silent, each step a reminder that survival depended not on strength alone, but on patience and awareness. The forest greeted them with bird calls and rustling leaves. Yet, beneath those sounds lay danger: predators, snakes, sudden storms. Each hunt was packed with uncertainty. Women busied themselves with morning tasks. They ground maize between stone slabs, the rhythmic scrape filling the air like a heartbeat. Children helped by carrying water from the river, their small arms struggling to lift clay pots filled to the brim. Older girls tended to the fire, feeding it sticks, coaxing flames to life. Some women prepared hides, stretching them over wooden frames, scraping them clean with sharp-edged stones until the leather was smooth and strong. Others tended to newborn animals: goats, dogs, chickens, creatures that had become companions in survival. The village was alive with motion, every task flowing into another, each person part of a larger rhythm. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, hides became clothing, ash became fertilizer for fields. Even broken pottery found new use, lining fire pits or marking boundaries around gardens. Every hand had purpose, every life a place. By midday, hunters returned with their catch: rabbits strung on vines, a pair of wild turkeys, and, with great effort, the carcass of a deer dragged through mud. Their faces shone with sweat, their eyes sharp with pride. Children ran to greet them, wide-eyed with excitement, touching the antlers, marveling at the size of the animal. The deer was not simply food, it was a gift of survival. Before it was cut apart, the hunters offered words of gratitude, thanking the spirit of the animal for giving its life. Then the work began: knives of obsidian slicing flesh, women washing the meat in the river, strips of venison laid across wooden racks to dry in the sun. Afternoon brought teaching. Elders gathered children in the shade of an oak, their voices deep and steady. They spoke of how the rivers had carved the land, of how fire was discovered, of how ancestors had crossed mountains and valleys to find this home. Their stories carried warnings too of times when greed poisoned harmony, when people forgot their bond with the land and suffered storms and famine. The children listened with rapt attention, some carving patterns into the dirt with sticks, others gazing at the sky, letting the words sink into memory. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched long and golden, the air cooled, and the songs of birds quieted, replaced by the hum of insects. Families gathered for the evening meal. Smoke curled from every fire, carrying the smell of roasted meat, of stewed beans and squash. People sat in circles, sharing food, laughter, stories. A child clutched his father's arm, asking questions about the hunt. A woman hummed softly as she braided her daughter's hair. The simple closeness of these moments bound them more tightly than any walls of stone ever could. Night came gently, the sky deepening into indigo, stars pricking holes in the darkness one by one. Fires burned bright, their glow casting faces in amber light. A drum began to beat, slow at first, then faster, voices rising to join it. The village sang together, a chorus that echoed into the trees and across the river. Their songs told of love and loss, of triumphs in the hunt, of gratitude for the land. The stars listened, cold and eternal, as humans below celebrated their fleeting, fragile existence with all the power of their voices. And when the singing faded, silence returned thick, sacred, alive. Families withdrew to their shelters, embers glowing red in the dark. The world seemed to breathe with them, one great heartbeat pulsing through earth, sky, and fire. Life was harsh, yes, but in those moments, surrounded by kin with bellies full and spirits lifted, life also felt eternal. The dawn came slowly, painting the horizon with pale streaks of gold. Mist clung to the lowlands, curling between the trees and over the river like a living spirit. The village stirred awake, one fire rekindled after another, smoke rising in slender threads toward the brightening sky. The air smelled of damp earth, of ash, of the faint sweetness of spring blossoms drifting on the breeze. Men rose first, stretching stiff limbs, pulling on hides that still carried the scent of last night's smoke. They left their shelters with spears and stone blades strapped to their sides, heading into the forest to hunt. Their footfalls were careful, silent, each step a reminder that survival depended not on strength alone, but on patience and awareness. The forest greeted them with bird calls and rustling leaves. Yet, beneath those sounds lay danger: predators, snakes, sudden storms. Each hunt was packed with uncertainty. Women busied themselves with morning tasks. They ground maize between stone slabs, the rhythmic scrape filling the air like a heartbeat. Children helped by carrying water from the river, their small arms struggling to lift clay pots filled to the brim. Older girls tended to the fire, feeding it sticks, coaxing flames to life. Some women prepared hides, stretching them over wooden frames, scraping them clean with sharp-edged stones until the leather was smooth and strong. Others tended to newborn animals: goats, dogs, chickens, creatures that had become companions in survival. The village was alive with motion, every task flowing into another, each person part of a larger rhythm. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, hides became clothing, ash became fertilizer for fields. Even broken pottery found new use, lining fire pits or marking boundaries around gardens. Every hand had purpose, every life a place. By midday, hunters returned with their catch: rabbits strung on vines, a pair of wild turkeys, and, with great effort, the carcass of a deer dragged through mud. Their faces shone with sweat, their eyes sharp with pride. Children ran to greet them, wide-eyed with excitement, touching the antlers, marveling at the size of the animal. The deer was not simply food. It was a gift of survival. Before it was cut apart, the hunters offered words of gratitude, thanking the spirit of the animal for giving its life. Then the work began: knives of obsidian slicing flesh, women washing the meat in the river, strips of venison laid across wooden racks to dry in the sun. Afternoon brought teaching. Elders gathered children in the shade of an oak, their voices deep and steady. They spoke of how the rivers had carved the land, of how fire was discovered, of how ancestors had crossed mountains and valleys to find this home. Their stories carried warnings too of times when greed poisoned harmony, when people forgot their bond with the land and suffered storms and famine. The children listened with rapt attention, some carving patterns into the dirt with sticks, others gazing at the sky, letting the words sink into memory. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched long and golden. The air cooled, and the songs of birds quieted. replaced by the hum of insects. Families gathered for the evening meal. Smoke curled from every fire, carrying the smell of roasted meat, of stewed beans and squash. People sat in circles, sharing food, laughter, stories. A child clutched his father's arm, asking questions about the hunt. A woman hummed softly as she braided her daughter's hair. The simple closeness of these moments bound them more tightly than any walls of stone ever could. Night came gently, the sky deepening into indigo, stars pricking holes in the darkness one by one. Fires burned bright, their glow casting faces in amber light. A drum began to beat, slow at first, then faster, voices rising to join it. The village sang together, a chorus that echoed into the trees and across the river. Their songs told of love and loss, of triumphs in the hunt, of gratitude for the land. The stars listened, cold and eternal, as humans below celebrated their fleeting, fragile existence with all the power of their voices. And when the singing faded, silence returned thick, sacred, alive. Families withdrew to their shelters, embers glowing red in the dark. The world seemed to breathe with them, one great heartbeat pulsing through earth, sky, and fire. Life was harsh, yes, but in those moments, surrounded by kin with bellies full and spirits lifted, life also felt eternal. The morning rose like a gentle promise, soft rays piercing through dense canopies and spilling over the river that wound lazily through the valley. The village was quiet at first, save for the soft murmur of water over stones and the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels and birds moved in the underbrush. Slowly, the people awoke, stretching stiff limbs, shaking the sleep from eyes still heavy with dreams of ancestors, of hunts, of spirits that walked in the night. Children were the first to stir. Barefoot and unsteady, they ran from one hut to another, their laughter ringing as they chased each other round piles of firewood and along the riverbank. The elders called gently to them, their voices deep and steady, guiding them to tasks small but essential, fetching water, gathering firewood, tidying the shelters. In every motion, the children learned the rhythm of responsibility, understanding that every hand mattered, every small task contributed to the survival of all. The hunters prepared silently. Spears were checked, arrows sharpened, nets braided from fibers gathered the day before. Faces were painted with streaks of ochre and charcoal, not as decoration, but as prayer, as armor, as a bridge between the human and the spiritual. Fathers led their sons into the forest, teaching them to move like the wind, to feel the pulse of the land beneath their feet. Each step was careful, deliberate. Each sound was studied: the crack of a twig underfoot, the distant flap of a bird's wings, the subtle shift in air that might indicate the approach of prey or predator. Women moved with a quiet intensity, hands busy and minds aware. They prepared the day's meals, grinding maize into coarse meal, mixing it with water and herbs to form sustenance for the hungry. They tended the young animals, goats and chickens that supplied milk and eggs. They repaired nets and baskets, sewing tiers with sinew and weaving patterns that had been taught for generations. Each stitch, each twist of fiber, carried meaning, knowledge passed down not through writing, but through touch, through observation, through the patient repetition of hands learning from hands. By midday, the hunters returned, carrying their catch: a deer, a handful of rabbits, fish pulled from a rapid bend in the river. The village gathered to greet them, children pressing forward to see the antlers and the sheen of freshly caught fish, women adjusting fires to cook, elders offering quiet thanks for the lives taken. Rituals were observed with care, the spirit of each animal honored, words of gratitude whispered, small offerings placed on stones at the riverbank. Nothing was wasted. Hides were prepared for clothing, bones for tools, sinews for binding. The flesh was cooked carefully, strips dried for preservation, each meal a meditation on survival, respect, and interconnectedness. The afternoon was devoted to teaching. The elders gathered children under the shade of a great oak. Stories flowed like water, tales of ancestors crossing mountains and plains, discovering rivers and valleys, learning which plants healed and which could harm. The children listened intently, their eyes wide, fingers tracing patterns in the dirt as they absorbed lessons that were invisible yet vital. These stories were more than entertainment, they were education, memory, culture, and guidance, ensuring that each generation knew its place, its duties, and the sacred balance of the land. As the sun began to dip, the river gleamed with reflected gold and crimson, and the shadows of trees stretched long across the fields. Families gathered to prepare the evening meal. Fires burned bright, the aroma of roasting meat and simmering vegetables filling the air. Children huddled close, listening as parents and elders spoke of the day's hunts, teaching the names of plants, animals, and stars. Laughter mingled with the crackle of fire, a sound as constant and grounding as the flow of the river itself. Night fell slowly, stars filling the sky with a brilliance unmatched in later centuries. Fires glowed in every shelter, embers dancing upward like spirits released into the heavens. Drums began to beat, first slowly, then with growing intensity. Voices rose, singing songs of gratitude, remembrance, and connection. The people danced, clapped, stamped in rhythm, moving in circles that mirrored the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the earth. The rhythm connected them to one another, to the land, to generations past and future. The forest around them was alive with unseen watchers, wolves, owls, foxes, all moving with a quiet awareness of the village's presence. Sometimes a deer would step cautiously to drink at the riverbank, frozen in the firelight. Every creature played its role, and the people moved in acknowledgement of the delicate balance. Respect was not taught through sermons, but through lived experience. Children learned that the forest was both home and adversary, a teacher whose lessons could be harsh, but were always necessary. Winter approached, and the first snow fell quietly on the distant peaks. Preparations intensified. Shelters were reinforced, food stores checked and replenished. Firewood was gathered in abundance. Elders taught the children songs and chants to lift the spirits during the long nights. Families huddled close, sharing warmth and stories, practicing the techniques that had kept them alive for centuries. Each day brought new lessons: how to move silently across frozen ground, how to read tracks in snow, how to anticipate storms before they arrived. Even in hardship, there was celebration. The arrival of the first snow was a cause for song, a recognition of the cycles that governed life. Children made patterns in the frost. Elders told tales of winters survived, of storms weathered, of ancestors who had guided their people through the most dangerous of times. Fires burned long, and within their glow, the village remained alive, a testament to endurance, community and balance. Hunger, illness, and danger were ever present, yet the people adapted. Herbs and roots were gathered for medicine. Traps were set to catch game. Shelters were maintained. Death was acknowledged with ceremony, birth celebrated with song. Every life mattered. Every contribution was honored. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, story to story, ensuring the survival of skills, wisdom, and memory. Through spring, summer, autumn, and winter, the rhythm persisted. The people understood the flow of water, the rise of the sun, the patterns of wind and rain. They understood that every action had consequence, that the world was a web of life in which they were both participants and witnesses. They moved with care, spoke with purpose, and lived with an awareness that each moment was both fleeting and sacred. And as stars wheeled overhead, the drums faded, the fires dimmed, and the village lay in silence. They slept with the knowledge that life continued, that tomorrow would demand courage and skill, and that their connection to each other, to the land, to generations past and yet to come was the true measure of survival. The first light of morning crept slowly across the valley, turning the tips of the trees golden and casting long shadows over the river that wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape. Mist clung to the lowlands, rising in gentle swirls as if spirits of the land were breathing. The village lay quiet, each hut still, yet the subtle movements of life began almost imperceptibly. Dogs stirred in their small shelters, chickens shook loose the sleep from their feathers, and children pressed sleepy faces against the wooden walls of their homes, listening to the murmur of the river and the distant cries of birds greeting the dawn. Men rose first. They stretched their limbs, stiff from the night, and tied on their simple leather garments. Spears and stone-tipped arrows were gathered, sharpened, and checked meticulously. Each hunter moved with intention. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. The forest beyond the village was alive, its every sound a potential sign. A snapped twig could announce the passage of prey or predator. Birds called in chorus, but one sudden silence could signal danger. The young men learned these lessons by observation, their fathers watching quietly, correcting nothing with words, letting the land teach what could not be taught by voice alone. Women began their work almost immediately. They ground maize with steady, practiced hands, turning coarse kernels into meal. The rhythm of grinding filled the air, blending with the distant splash of river water and the cries of children who ran errands or chased each other. Other women tended to the animals, the goats, chickens, and young dogs whose presence had become vital to life in the village. They fed them, cleaned their pens, and learned to anticipate sickness before it became dangerous. The simple acts of care carried profound meaning. Survival depended not only on hunting, but on sustaining every living thing that belonged to the community. The village was a web of activity. Elders supervised children, teaching them to carry water without spilling, to gather firewood efficiently, to respect the boundaries of sacred areas in the forest. Tools were repaired and reused. Nets and ropes were woven from plant fibers, hides scraped and stretched for clothing or coverings. Even the simplest stone was valued. A sharp-edged rock could split bone, carve wood, or create fire with skill. Nothing was wasted. Every resource was honored, every task deliberate, and every individual understood their place within the larger circle of life. By mid-morning, hunters returned, Their catch varied: rabbits, turkeys, or, on a successful day, a deer dragged through the mud, its antlers heavy with morning dew. Children gathered, eyes wide, pressing forward to see the prize. Women began immediate preparations for cooking and preservation. Fires were built along the riverbank, embers glowing red, stones set to support roasting frames. Meat was sliced, portions saved for drying in the sun, bones set aside for tools. Sinews twisted into cords. Elders offered words of gratitude to the spirits of the animal, for each life taken was a gift, a sacrifice that ensured the survival of the village. The afternoon brought instruction. Under the shade of great oaks, elders taught the young about the patterns of nature, the signs of the wind, the tracks of animals, and the cycles of the moon. Lessons were embedded in stories, tales of ancestors who followed herds across the plains, who learned which plants healed, which were deadly, and how the rivers and mountains guided their journeys. These were not mere fables. Every story carried practical knowledge, advice on survival, and guidance on living in harmony with the land. Children learned not only to listen, but to interpret, to understand that the world was a series of signs and responses. As the sun dipped low, the village shifted focus. Fires were rekindled, smoke curling into the sky. Families gathered to prepare their evening meals. The aroma of roasting meat and boiling vegetables filled the air. Songs rose, soft at first, then growing in volume as the work progressed. Children sat on the edges of the circle, asking questions, observing techniques, absorbing lessons that words alone could never convey. The fire was central, its warmth sustaining both body and spirit. Evening brought ritual. Drums were beaten slowly, a steady rhythm that mirrored the pulse of the land. Voices joined the drums, singing in harmony, celebrating life, survival, and the cycles of nature. Dances followed, movements reflecting the seasons, slow, deliberate steps imitating the stalking of prey, the flight of birds, the flow of rivers. Every movement had meaning. Every sound reinforced connection to each other, to ancestors, and to the earth itself. The forest beyond the village remained alert. Wolves watched from a distance, their eyes reflecting the firelight. Deer and other animals moved cautiously, aware of human presence. The people understood that balance was essential. Hunting was necessary, yet respect for life and land was paramount. Lessons of patience, timing, and humility were taught through these interactions, reinforcing the principle that humans were part of nature, not separate from it. Winter approached. The first snows dusted the peaks beyond the valley, signaling a time for preparation. Shelters were reinforced, food stores examined and replenished. Elders instructed the young on the subtle techniques of winter survival, tracking animals through snow, identifying frozen water sources, and tending firewood stores to ensure warmth throughout long nights. Families practiced songs and chants to lift spirits against the harshness of winter, maintaining morale and unity. Even in hardship, joy persisted. The first snowfall was a cause for celebration, not despair. Children played in the new frost, patterns forming beneath their feet. Elders shared stories of past winters survived, teaching resilience and patience. Fires burned long into the night, a glow of life and continuity amid the cold. The rhythm of daily survival was punctuated by laughter, song, and shared work, reinforcing the bonds that kept the village alive. Through the cycles of birth, death, hunting, and harvest, the people remained vigilant. Every day brought lessons of endurance. Every season demanded adaptation. Herbs and roots were gathered for medicine, traps set for food, and shelters maintained with precision. Death was acknowledged with reverence, birth celebrated with song. Every life mattered, every action contributed to the community, and every generation ensured that the knowledge of survival was passed down through practice, story, and example. Spring returned after the harshest months, a season of rebirth. The rivers swelled, carrying nourishment and shaping the land anew. Green shoots broke through thawed soil, birds returned, and animals moved with renewed energy. The people celebrated with dances and songs, honoring the resilience that allowed life to continue. Children ran barefoot, laughter mingling with the music of rivers and wind, their presence a testament to the circle of life and its continuity. Hunger, illness, and danger were constants, yet the people endured. They learned to read the land, to interpret signs, and to anticipate challenges. Each day required focus. Each season demanded planning. They lived not only with the awareness of survival, but with an understanding of connection to each other, to the land, to ancestors, and to the spirits that governed life and death. Night after night, the fires burned, casting flickering light across faces filled with contentment, vigilance, and reverence. Drums and songs echoed into the trees, a living reminder that life was both fleeting and eternal. The rhythm of the village mirrored the pulse of the natural world, a harmony that ensured both survival and meaning. Through hardship and joy alike, the people persisted. They lived with awareness, care, and respect, each action tied to the balance of life. Their days, though filled with labor, were rich in connection. Their nights, though long and dark, were warm with community, story, and song. And through it all, the lessons of the land, the ancestors, and the cycles of life were never forgotten, forming a living memory that would carry forward, generation to generation, long after individual voices had faded into the night. The moon rose high above the valley, its pale glow spilling across the land, silvering the tops of the huts and the rippling river. The air was cool, carrying with it the sense of smoke, earth, and pine resin. The village gathered once more round the great fire, their voices quieter than during the day. At night, the world felt different, more mysterious, more dangerous, yet also more sacred. Shadows danced against the trunks of trees, and every crackle of the fire seemed to answer the whispers of the forest. Elders spoke in low tones, voices heavy with wisdom. They told the children that the night was not merely the absence of the sun, but a realm of its own, alive with spirits that walked unseen. To wander carelessly was to risk angering them, or worse, to lose oneself in darkness forever. Stories unfolded tales of hunters who failed to honor the spirits and never returned, of those who mocked the rituals and found misfortune at every step. The children listened with wide eyes, clutching their blankets, knowing that even if they feared these tales, they were lessons meant to keep them alive. The fire was fed carefully, never allowed to die. It was not only a source of warmth, but a guardian against the unknown. Sparks drifted upward like glowing insects, vanishing into the starry sky. Around it, families huddled together, the rhythm of drums slower now, almost like the steady heartbeat of the earth. Songs turned into chants, repeating phrases that carried power. each word resonating with the memory of ancestors. On certain nights, rituals became more elaborate. Painted faces appeared, designs drawn with ash, clay, and berry dyes. Movements grew sharper, chants louder, as if calling directly to the unseen world. A deer skull might be worn as a mask, feathers tied into hair, bones shaken as rattles. These were not mere performances. They were bridges, acts of reverence, ways to remind the spirits that humans remembered their place in the web of life. Children were taught to sit still during these rituals, to breathe slowly, to absorb the rhythm without distraction. They would not yet understand the deeper meaning, but they would carry the memory. Someday, when their time came, they would step into the circle, paint their own faces, and chant the same words that had been spoken for countless generations. Continuity mattered. To forget was to sever the cord that tied them to their ancestors. Yet, even within solemnity, life retained warmth. Between rituals, laughter returned. Families shared jokes. Parents teased their children. Young men boasted about hunts to impress young women. Stories shifted from warnings to humor, tales of animals outsmarting hunters, or clumsy mistakes turned into lessons. The night became both a classroom and a celebration, reminding everyone that survival was not only about enduring hardship, but also finding joy within it. As the seasons cycled once more, the people adapted to every change. Spring brought floods, forcing them to rebuild certain shelters on higher ground. Summer brought abundance, but also heat that tested endurance. Autumn demanded preparation, gathering every seed, drying every piece of meat, repairing every crack in the huts. Winter returned, harsh as ever, but now familiar. Its challenges expected, its lessons remembered. Births occurred with cries that blended into the rhythm of daily life. New mothers were supported, children welcomed with chants of blessing. Deaths came to quiet departures marked with songs of farewell. Fires built high to guide the spirits to the beyond. Each event tied the people closer together, reminding them that they were part of something greater. A cycle both unbroken and eternal. There were nights when silence ruled. The village would sit without song, listening only to the wind moving through the trees, the hoot of an owl, or the far-off howl of wolves. In those silences, thoughts grew heavier. Men reflected on hunts, women on the health of children, elders on the future of the tribe. Silence itself became a teacher, reminding all that even in stillness, the world spoke, and one needed only to listen. Generations rose and fell, yet the patterns of life endured. Children became hunters, hunters became elders, and elders became stories. Knowledge flowed like a river, never stopping, always carried forward. The people did not write their history in ink or stone, but in memory, in ritual, in song, and in the unbroken line of daily survival. On one particular night, as stars filled the sky in a dazzling arc, an elder whispered that every spark above was the fire of an ancestor, watching, guiding, remembering. Children looked upward, their faces lit by both firelight and starlight, and for a moment, the weight of countless generations pressed gently upon them. They felt small, but not alone, part of something vast, timeless, and unending. The night deepened. One by one, families retreated into their huts. The fire dimmed, left to smolder, its last embers glowing faintly. Only the guards remained awake, spears in hand, ears tuned to every rustle of the forest. The village lay quiet, resting, breathing, dreaming. The cycle of survival would begin anew at dawn. But for now, beneath the watchful stars, the people slept safe in the knowledge that their way of life, fragile yet enduring, carried the strength of every ancestor who had ever lived. And thus, through countless days and nights, through hardship and joy, through ritual and story, through fire and shadow, the people of the ancient world lived not as separate from the earth, but as one with it, their every breath an echo of the land itself. For the wind carried with it the scent of change, dry earth lifting into the air as the people gathered their belongings and prepared for a journey that none could truly measure. The elders had spoken for weeks, warning of the shifting climate, the dwindling animals in the forests, the rivers that seemed thinner each season. Now, the decision was final. The village would move. Not a small hunting trip, not a seasonal shift, but a full migration to lands beyond the horizon. Lands none of them had seen, but which were whispered about in old stories, told by the fire. Families packed what little they had: woven mats, stone tools, dried food stores, and the bones of ancestors carried in carved wooden boxes. The children clung to their mothers, eyes wide with excitement and fear. Dogs barked, sensing the tension in the air, while men tied together bundles of spears and hunting gear. Everyone was needed. No one would stay behind. The valley that had cradled them for generations would be left to silence, their footprints fading with the wind. At dawn, the long line formed. Elders led the way, leaning on carved staffs, their eyes scanning the distant horizon where mountains loomed faint and blue. Hunters walked at the edges, alert for danger, while women carried infants and baskets heavy with roots and dried berries. The river was their guide, winding like a silver serpent through the plains, promising both water and a path. The first steps were heavy, not with weight, but with the gravity of leaving behind everything known. Days stretched into weeks. The sun burned during daylight hours, forcing them to cover their heads with animal hides and move slowly. At night, the cold sank deep, and fires had to be carefully tended despite limited wood. Children cried from hunger when the game was scarce, and hunters often returned empty-handed, their faces drawn with frustration. But there were moments of abundance to a herd of bison brought down with coordinated spears, or nets heavy with fish when the river swelled. Each successful hunt meant another day of survival, another chance to push forward. The land itself tested them. Forests gave way to open plains, where the wind howled without resistance and predators could see them from miles away. Wolves circled the group at night, glowing eyes appearing beyond the firelight. Sometimes they attacked, and men fought them back with spears, their shouts mixing with the snarls of beasts. On other nights, storms broke suddenly, lightning splitting the sky, rain turning the earth to mud. Families huddled together beneath animal hides, praying the wind would not scatter their fires. Yet they endured. Every hardship became a lesson, every obstacle a shared memory that bound them tighter as a people. Children grew stronger, their legs accustomed to walking miles each day. Women learned to weave new baskets from unfamiliar plants. Men adapted their hunting methods, studying the movements of different animals, the flight of birds that hinted at water ahead. Elders told stories each night to keep spirits alive. reminding them that migration itself was part of the cycle of life, that their ancestors had walked similar paths long before weeks turned into moons. The mountains grew closer, their snowy peaks gleaming like distant teeth. Crossing them would be dangerous, but there was no choice. Beyond lay the fertile valleys spoken of in legend. Food grew scarcer as they approached the rocky slopes. The river thinned into streams, and firewood became harder to find. Blisters split feet. Children fell sick, and the elderly struggled to keep pace. Still, no one was left behind. The strong carried the weak, and the group moved as one body, bound by loyalty and survival. The ascent began slowly. Narrow trails wound upward, steep cliffs rising on either side. Cold bit into their skin, harsher with each step, and the thin air stole their breath. Snow fell without warning, blinding them, covering paths they had walked only moments before. Hunters scouted ahead, marking the safest routes with broken branches and carved stones. They built shelters from rock and hide, huddling together at night as wind screamed through the peaks. It was in these mountains that they first encountered another people. At dawn, while the camp stirred, shadows appeared on a ridge above them, figures cloaked in furs, spears glinting in the rising sun. The migrants froze, uncertain whether these strangers were friend or foe. The tension was heavy, silence broken only by the whistle of the wind. Then, slowly, the strangers descended, their leader raising a hand not in threat, but in acknowledgement. What followed was a cautious exchange. The two groups did not share language, but gestures bridged the gap. The strangers offered dried meat and water in carved wooden bowls, while the migrants shared tools and ornaments of bone. There was no trust, not yet, but there was no bloodshed either. That alone was victory. For several days, the two groups camped near each other, watching, learning, trading small gifts. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the strangers vanished back into the mountains, leaving behind only footprints in the snow and stories the migrants would carry for generations. The crossing took moons. Many fell ill. Some died, their bodies laid to rest beneath cairns of stone. Prayers whispered into the freezing air. But at last, the mountains released them, opening into a wide valley lush with rivers, forests, and game unlike anything they had seen in months. Relief swept through the people like fire. Children ran laughing into the grass. Hunters cheered as they spotted deer and elk grazing, and women gathered berries in their baskets with trembling hands. They had made it. The valley became their new home. Huts were built quickly, fires rekindled, and rituals performed to honor both the land and the spirits of those lost along the way. Life returned to rhythm, hunting, gathering, storytelling, song. Yet they were not the same people who had left the old valley. Hardship had forged them into something stronger, wiser, more united. They carried scars, but also knowledge. They had seen the vastness of the world, felt its cruelty, and survived its tests. And so, each night, as they sat by the fire and looked toward the stars, they remembered the journey. They remembered the winds of the plains, the wolves that circled their fires, the storms that drowned their shelters, and the snow that nearly buried them. They remembered the faces of those who had not made it, the elders who had guided them, and the strangers whose brief kindness had helped them endure. These memories were not burdens, they were treasures, carved into the soul of the people. stories to be passed down for as long as fire burned and voices could speak. Their journey was not the end, but the beginning of countless others. For migration was life itself, movement was survival, and survival was the heartbeat of humanity. And in that valley, beneath the gaze of the mountains they had conquered, they began again, stronger, wiser, unbroken,